and bring the parties together, or is it something where you can scale up from local to state, national, and global, right? So this is a question for all three panelists. I don't know in what order we want to go, but I can see Bill here, so I will ask Bill to chime in first.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, for example, that 40% phosphorus reduction goal is really important. I think it's important to have goals at that large scale. So I think, we need to be thinking about not just local benefits, but what do we need at a larger scales. And then I think from a local perspective, not every site, not every place is the same. So thinking about the points that Chris was making about how difficult the challenge is with the Western Lake Erie Basin, you got a 40% phosphorus reduction goal, but not every farm is contributing the same amount of phosphorus. Not every place where you might put a wetland to capture and treat nutrients is going to be as successful as the next place. You do have to start trying to target where you're working and who you're trying to get to engage in the activities you need to have done. So that's kind of more of a local lens. And then those things that have to happen at the local level, you're not going to force them through eminent domain or something to happen. It takes relationships. It takes relationships with the farmers and the people in those communities. So I think I can see those pieces fitting together that way. So I don't know if that's kind of an overly simplistic answer, but yeah, those local solutions do help to feed up to the larger scale impacts that you're looking for at the scale of the 40% phosphorus reduction. Climate change is a huge animal, but that one, yeah, I mean, you could every CO2 ton that you reduce, whether it's from a farm or a forest or a city power plant, contributes the same way to the atmosphere. And so that one's a really interesting one because I think it is one where we can all make a difference, truly.
I'm going to turn it over to Alina to respond. I'm going to add one sort of a continuation to this question from Ian Sheldon. In the way we think about regional and across states or across jurisdictions. So how do these jurisdictions really matter? So as an example, if we were to think about California's proposed system for carbon emissions and to create these border carbon adjustments, and that could then lead to this, a conflict, or at least a non-alignment between state and federal issues regarding who has the authority to set these policies, what sort of legal framework do we need for individual states to implement certain policies that are not federally implemented, right? So that, again, just speaking about the scale of where we can, how we can address sustainability questions and what might be the implications of across region trade-offs in this case.
Yeah, that's a great question, or set of questions. It's a complicated one, but I think a starting point to think about any of these issues is what is the scale of the impact. And so when we think about climate change, it's obviously a global impact. As Bill was saying, a ton of carbon emitted any place is contributing globally to the problem, and impacts are felt globally. Now, of course, those impacts are uneven. Some are affected more than others, and some have the ability to adapt more than others. And so, impacts are uneven, but the contribution of a ton of pollution, in this case carbon, is equal in terms of contributions to climate change. And so from that point of view, it's or anything like that is a global issue or impact. The international cooperation and agreements are absolutely critical. And so, what happened in Paris and what has happened in the other international agreements around climate change are absolutely essential. And the intergovernmental bodies that are trying to help motivate policymakers and encourage policies like the IPCC are absolutely essential. And so, by way of example, in 2018, IPCC came out with recommendations to cut emissions of carbon by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And so that's a really clear target that's based on this desire to not push beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global warming relative to pre-industrial levels. And that's something that then that can be downscaled, right? Any community, any organization, even thinking about this, you know, from an individual firm or business point of view, can take that and adapt that goal and try to achieve that. And if we all were to do that, then obviously we would achieve the goal. And so, you know, Ohio State has carbon emission reduction goals that the president just announced recently. So we all can do this, and we all can play a part, and that's absolutely, I think, the right way of thinking about it. Even though you know, the costs of doing so are going to be different across space and across organizations, and so there needs to also be flexibility. And so when we think of that, you know, we can set a target, but then we allow flexibility, kind of to the point that Chris was making in terms of how we approach these problems. You know, local conditions are going to determine what the best approach is, and whether that is a regulatory approach, or whether it is a voluntary approach, or whether it is a different approach, you know, maybe something that has more to do with educational campaigns or social media campaigns, or, you know, trying to change the culture of a place, or, you know, to the point about how do we get people to work together. It's maybe something that's more on the social or behavioral side. So I think the solutions have to be locally tailored, even though the problems are global in nature. And I guess the other point then is, you know, in terms of how these things vary across regions or across states, again, it really speaks to the importance of having strong leadership at, I think, either international level or federal level. And if we had strong leadership on these issues from a federal level, we would avoid a lot of the problems that we're encountering with states having such different approaches.
Chris, would you like to add anything to this?
Sure. So I very much agree with our panelists, and I very much agree with what Elena just said, but I also like to think about this from a slightly different angle. So, you know, I agree, leadership is essential. You need governmental leadership. In the absence of that, you don't have anything. But I go back to, can you have true governmental leadership if the population is either uninformed, is too busy raising their families and working to become conversant in the issue? Because at the end of the day, and this is something that I don't have the answer to, and I go back and forth in my own mind on this. Whether it's a local community or a national community or even an international community, in the absence of understanding and buy-in from a large part of the populace, if you will, I think you're only going to get so far, because, you know, the politics will play out as it always does. That's something that I think we're always going to be living with. So the question is, should we ask people to leave it to experts and governmental bureaucrats like myself and academic experts and our political leadership to decide these issues? Or should we say, no, or put it another way, this would work a lot better if informed people voice their opinions. It's really hard to get people informed. You know, in our community, we all tend to talk to each other. There's a bit of an environmental echo chamber because many of us have similar views, and we tend to reinforce each other's views, and we know the lingo and the acronyms and the dialogue. But we represent a very small portion, and I'll just use America, of the American public. Most people who are not in our business, in our field, do they understand these issues all that well? They see a newspaper article. Do they have time to read it? Again, like everyone else, people are trying to work, make a living, raise their kids, do all the things that people want to do. So I always struggle with that question about, to what extent should we and can we get buy-in in order for us as a political entity, whatever that is, to move forward?
Mm-hmm. just a quick follow-up before we can switch to, there are a couple other really good questions here from the audience, but a quick follow-up here is, and I'm combining a couple questions here from the audience as well. One is this issue of, buy-in. Is it possible when there is an inherent free rider problem, right? What we are dealing with as economists, we know that there is an incentive to free ride. There is no reason to contribute to the public good if someone else will do it. And so is buy-in a way to do it, especially when we are seeing, as Alan Lyons points out here, that voluntary compliance is really not working. So just going with trying to get people on board has not been successful in many of our grand challenges, at least. And it's going to really require some sort of policy that comes from states and federal governments. And so when do you think that change will happen, or what kinds of policies do you think could be moving us in that direction, right? And so I'll pause to get some input here, and then I'd like to raise another question about cap and trade as one of those policies.
So I'll just jump in quickly if I can. So I think the poster child for what ultimately does it take to drive action is, let's go back to the 1960s and the 1970s when the American public, now, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but we all know that the conventional story, which I think is largely true, is that the American public realized they had a tremendous environmental problem in the United States. Now, we talk about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. We talk about other rivers burning. We talk about the state of where we were. But I do think that after, we had Denora, Pennsylvania. Before that, we had other issues. I think at a certain point, people began to demand, and their politicians began to demand, based on the fact that the problems were so significant and people were experiencing these problems, that they said there needs to be change. So unfortunately, it took things to get very bad before there was sort of a groundswell of support for doing something differently.
That's great. So one of the policies, right, that is generally moving forward and a lot of people want to adopt is a cap and trade type of policy for conservation, for natural resource conservation. So a question here from the audience, and I think this is applicable to all panelists, but I'll target it to Alina first, is how can we responsibly use cap and trade policy to fund conservation? And are we reaching limits where we are not in a position to continue to allow markets to get to that efficient outcome, or is it better to continue to take local responsibility for conservation in certain regions, right? So this still is in the line, along the lines of that local versus the scope itself, but how far can we go with cap and trade policy? And I think I'd like to hear from everyone. Chris has also implemented a pollution trading in the Great Lakes as well. So I'd love to hear from all three panelists, but we'll start with Alina.
Yeah, thanks. I thought that was a great question. And cap and trade is a great example of kind of a combination approach to thinking about a strong sustainability limit in aggregate that then but then allows for the flexibility for individual level behaviors based on differences in costs in terms of meeting those pollution reduction goals. So the cap and trade idea is basically that we would set a overall limit, for example, in terms of pollution reduction. You could take the 40% reduction in phosphorus as an example, or you could take what is more common with the carbon emission reduction goals in terms of cap and trade that California and Europe and other places have implemented. And the idea is that at an aggregate level, we're limiting and setting a strong sustainability limit on the pollution or emission controls. And and that within that, we're then assigning value in terms of credits that get traded in the market for meeting the pollution reduction goals. And so individual firms or farmers, whoever it might be, have then the flexibility to choose whether they're going to purchase permits that allow them to emit pollution or whether they're going to make those reductions on their own. And so it's a way of introducing flexibility into the system in a market-based trading kind of way. So it's a great example of what I was talking about at the end of my slides in terms of how do we incorporate a strong sustainability approach with an approach that still allows flexibility and trade-offs depending on what the different costs are across different actors. So to the second part of that question, should we still enforce limits on kind of at a more local scale? I thought that was also a great question. I think the answer in my mind is that we should do that, but we should be very parsimonious and careful in terms of how we do that. Because if we're really trying to incentivize and inspire responsibility at the local level for greater conservation, regulation is probably not the best approach for doing that. That's probably not going to inspire people to take ownership, although it certainly may create the right incentives. For example, if we were to apply a tax on carbon or on other pollution. But I think that as we think about what is it at a local level that might justify protection or conservation, it's along the lines of what is a critical natural resource or natural capital stock. Lake Erie certainly is a critical natural capital stock because it's unique. There is no other Lake Erie. The kinds of forest networks that Bill was talking about also constitute a critical natural capital stock because by creating those networks, you're creating resiliency among the forests and the ecosystem services that they're providing that otherwise a single plot could not generate, or even a multiple plots separated could not generate. And so I think we have to think about what are the ways in which we're preserving these. How do we define and think about critical natural capital stocks? And once we're able to define and identify what those critical stocks are, using some combination of protections and limits along with market-based incentives is the right approach.
Thank you. I'll invite others to chime in as well. Bill, would you like to go next?
Yeah, this is near and dear to my heart in a lot of ways. I worked my first 10 years at Nature Conservancy developing forest carbon offset projects that were part of a cap and trade system. And the way that works is really the cap and trade systems work best on entities that you can measure kind of where the emissions might be coming from. So generally you'll have regulation on a power plant, for example, or power companies. And the way you get conservation, so they'll have a certain limit that they need to meet, and then they can buy credits from others that might have reduced beyond the target that they need to meet. And another element of it is that they allow for offsets. Not all of them do, but some of them allow for offsets. And the way offsets work, it can be something external from those businesses that are being regulated, that if they can show that they're reducing emissions, those companies can then buy some of the needed credits from those entities that are producing those credits. It might be from a renewable energy project, or in the case of the Nature Conservancy, a forest conservation management project. And kind of the point of the question here too was, how do you make sure that, I'm going to reinterpret it, but that system's not abused, so that they're not making any reductions at the factory and they're just buying offsets, and it's not maybe having some of those co-benefits that you could realize at a local scale. In the California market, the way that they manage that is you can't get more than 8% of your reductions through offsets. So they put a cap on kind of the amounts you can get from offsets, which is positive thing for the state. So the other thing I want to mention is this kind of cap and trade approach is used in other ways. Thinking about the Clean Water Act, which is one of those regulations that Chris was referring to that really made a huge difference in water quality. A part of that also was to protect wetlands. and a no net loss of wetlands kind of rule. So there basically was a cap, if you will, or a floor set on the amount of wetlands that we need to have as a country. So if you're doing a development project now and you're impacting a wetland, in the state of Ohio, we require that you somehow make up for that impact. So first of all, you're required to try to reduce that impact locally and not infect that wetland as much as possible. And then if you can't avoid any consequence of the wetland, you can then purchase mitigation credits. And the way that that's done on the kind of a local scale, there is a limit to where that new wetland restoration project or creation project can occur. It has to occur within the same watershed as where the impact was. So there are ways of kind of managing that. It allows some flexibility. It doesn't have to be right next door, but it needs to be in the same general watershed. So there are ways of kind of using those cap and trade type approaches really successfully, I think, to drive conservation at scales that really can make a difference. I think it's a really exciting tool.
Thank you. Chris, we'd like to hear your take on this question as well.
Sure. You know, and one thing I've noticed, oh, my wife is bringing me a cup of coffee. Thank you, sweet pea. One thing I've noticed about home conferences is the lawnmower always starts just as you're ready to start talking. So hopefully that won't interfere. I'm just going to make a very brief comment just based on experience. So, you know, for the last 10 years or so, I've been working in the Great Lakes realm. But the vast majority of my career, I was an air pollution control lawyer. I spent most of my time dealing with the Clean Air Act. And over a period of years, developed some pretty good chops in that area, all of which I've forgotten now. But I remember around the 2008, 2009 timeframe, the House, you know, the U.S. House of Representatives actually passed climate change, a climate change bill. And I remember a colleague in the Ohio, in the director's office at EPA, Drew Bergman, and I waiting through these 800 and 900 page bills, trying to understand, you know, the cap and trade and how they would work and local impacts. And different bills would come out, and then we'd wade through another 900 page bill. So when I discuss cap and trade, the foremost question that I always wrestle with is, how does it get enacted and become a reality? Because in the absence of figuring out how that's going to happen, I struggle. And we know that there were regional cap and trade plans that were developed back in the days, RGGI in the Northeast. I forget what they called the one out in California in the Western states. There was an attempt at a Midwestern one. I don't know if those even still exist anymore. But to think that we had legislation in the House, and the story that I heard was the then EPA administrator went to the president and said, with your support, we might be able to push this across the line. And the answer was, look, I've got affordable health care and I've got climate. It's got to be one or the other. We can't split our resources. And they chose affordable care, and ultimately climate change didn't get traction in the Senate, and it never went forward. So to me, that's a lesson learned about, for this to become a reality, I think about what is it going to take to get over those political hurdles to get this done. And it goes back to the question about, to what extent does the American public need to understand what this is about? Is this something that is more of something the American people feel, or is this purely a political exercise based on voting? So I'll stop there.
Okay, I think, you know, we're getting close to noon, but if we can take a few more minutes, I want to touch on at least one question that's come from the audience, but also one that I am personally really interested in, is thinking about this question about inter and intragenerational equity, right? And when we talk about sustainability, at least from a conceptual standpoint, we've been considering how you maintain resources in a way that can not restrict availability of capital for the future. There's very little that we know about what that means for distributional impacts. locally and within a generation. And this is not only from a theoretical standpoint, but even in the projects that we implement, in the specific areas that get status of being conserved land, and how you choose which place becomes a hotspot for conservation and which place doesn't, inherently does involve trade-offs, and those trade-offs have distributional implications. So my question here, and this is, just thinking about this from a conceptual basis, the question is, if we aside from distributional consequences, are there any questions left? Is that really the big issue when it comes to sustainability, both within the current generation and across generations? Is the entire question of sustainability about distribution? So that's I think wrapping some of the questions here as well, and specifically for intergeneration, we know we think about it in terms of discount rates. How do those things square together? So because Alina brought it up in her talk, I'll start with Alina and then go to the others.
My quick answer, yes. It is all about distribution, inter and intra. And there's a lot that we haven't thought through there in terms of how we implement that. But keeping it at a conceptual level, I'll just appeal to what many probably know as Rawlsian veil of ignorance, which the idea being that we know what the impacts are of any decision on all the different groups in society. And if we were to adapt the Rawlsian method of determining what the right decision is, we would adapt this veil of ignorance, meaning that while we understand the impacts, we don't know where we stand in those groups, right? So we know how poor people might be affected. We know how wealthier people might be affected. What we don't know is, am I, as the decision maker, a wealthy person or a poor person? And if we all had that veil of ignorance, the theory is that we would make much more just decisions. And I do believe that that's true. And I do believe that that is an approach to decision making that we should take in both inter and intra generational decisions. I'll leave it at that.
I'll invite Bill to chime in as well, especially because I think your talk was more on the idea that we can find win-wins in many situations, and it's not always about a trade-off. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the distributional issue.
Yeah, it's a huge, hairy topic. I love Elena's theoretical concept. The veil would be super. I don't think it's reality. I think Chris made a lot of points along these lines as well, that people do have their interests. And, some of the things that, I guess what's brought me to want to try to get the wins where I can get them and not always go for the perfect is just getting that incremental progress and the pride of success. I've seen people get excited about that and like to be a part of something big like that. And so I do think, to have lasting solutions, it can't be, you're going to need to get more consensus. I think Chris brought up some great examples of the cap and trade, and, you can have something through an executive order that sounds great, and we celebrate it, and then it goes away 4 years later because there wasn't that consensus and that buy-in. So it's frustrating, it's difficult, but I think that, in some ways, but really, I think that is the way that we're going to get lasting results, is to get that buy-in. Elena, I love your idea of the veil. I'm not sure how we get that, but you get people more, I often used to say these are science questions. They're not really moral questions. I come from a science background, and as I get older, these are moral questions. They are science questions. We need the goals, but there's a lot of morality issues here. And I think that's at the core, frankly, of our success moving forward, is who we want to be as a society and the morals we use to define that vision for ourselves and our future really is important. So I'll just leave it at that myself.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
I'm gonna, as we're coming to the close, I want to ask one last question, which did come up from one of our audience as well, and we have not really talked about the current situation we're in right now. And what are your thoughts on how this pandemic and a really coming to a standstill has potentially impacted the way we think about sustainability? And this could be, you know, ranging from, yes, there are environmental conditions that have potentially improved. There's ample evidence that air quality is getting better. People aren't moving anywhere. But what does the future look like? And what does sustainability mean when some businesses are barely surviving? So what, you know, how do we get at whose sustainability? Chris, you brought this question up at the beginning when you talked about what is sustainability and sustainability for whom. So I would invite you to share your thoughts first on how do you think the way we think and the way we could address sustainability has potentially changed because of the COVID-19 situation?
Well, I'll take a quick stab. Boy, that's a mouthful to get around, but a couple quick thoughts. So I'll just point out from the governmental perspective, one of the things that's rapidly became clear to me is even for old duffers like myself, we found out that it was not that difficult to figure out how to work from home and communicate. Again, we're communicating today with several hundred people. We're exchanging ideas and information. In my office now, or I should say not in my office now, but my staff and I we're still solving the Great Lakes issues, or at least doing our best to solve the Great Lakes issues. It really hasn't slowed us down at all. So that makes you wonder about, well, do we need buildings? Do we need desks? Do we need the kind of infrastructure that we've historically had to keep things running? One could argue, maybe not. Maybe that becomes, it requires fewer inputs, if you will, to do that. Now, I just read a really interesting article that talks about the dichotomy during this COVID crisis about people with college educations who are much more likely to be able to work at home versus people who are either working in restaurants, they're working in whatever they're doing. They don't have that option. They don't have that luxury. And that's been a huge equitable split. So does it become sustainable for them? So I would just say the way that the American workplace has worked, at least in terms of offices, I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way we were. I think that's going to change. There will be permanent changes as a result of this. And I think the equity issues that are raised by that are something we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Lena, your thoughts?
Just quickly, I don't know who said it, but whoever said never let a crisis go to waste, I think that there is something in that, and that in this moment, I think we find ourselves much more aware of others in the ways that Chris was saying in terms of the inequities that are coming to the forefront, that were always there, and they're just magnified because of the situation we're in right now, as well as just the basic interdependence that we all have, because we all depend on each other in terms of maintaining health or not maintaining our health. And it just underscores the extreme interdependence that we have as a society, and I think provides a window into potential future climate change scenarios, which frankly could be a lot worse in terms of impacts and the inequities that get exposed. So I think it's a great opportunity. I hope that we can seize it in a way that will help address some of these underlying problems.
Thanks. Bill, do you want to have the last word here? Actually, Brent will have
the
last word, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with Chris and Elena said. I don't have a lot to add, but I just want to add a little bit of perspective from the Nature Conservancy. We're seeing so many people just enjoy getting outside and really value getting into nature right now. And I think you're seeing the resilience of nature, and the birds building their nests, the young animals, and the life goes on. And It's been really rewarding. We've seen a 200% increase in our trail use at our preserves, and I just think it's nice to have a resource that we can provide at this time to allow people to get outside. And the state's done the same thing. We're following their lead really in a lot of ways, and that's been really rewarding, I would say. And I think it's helping people to value nature in ways that they might have lost touch with, and that's been a silver lining for us.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't really know if I have anything more to add here, but it's, this is one of the, it's a situation that is unprecedented and potentially a way where maybe not right now, but a year from now, we're probably going to see at least some kinds of behavioral changes that at all levels, individuals to corporations. We might think of the new green company being one that allows people more flexibility working at home, or just seeing less commute because we have potentially adapted to working remotely, and ways in which this might affect other resources as well. I mean, I think if we could have a whole other panel on how it affects the food supply and the resource constraints as well. But without getting into any further, I would like to thank everyone for sharing really insightful perspectives here, and I will hand it back to Brent to have the last word.
Yeah, thanks so much, Satya, and thanks to all of our panelists. We really appreciate the insights you provided this morning. To all of our guests who are still on, I know we went a couple minutes long, but it was definitely worth it for me and hopefully for you as well. All of these talks are recorded, and we'll have a website available, so if you want to view anything later, you can do that. We'll provide that to all the people who register for this event.